Whenever the passion of the church is beginning to be expressed in a more and more intense way, then 9 times out of 10 there's a betrayal going on. And that betrayal often centers around the holy sacrifice of the Mass and the real presence of our Lord Jesus Christ in the most blessed sacrament. It's scriptural. Recently, one of the more prominent shepherds of the church who saw firsthand the liturgical disaster as it has come about in the last 40 years, he's come forward in his old age and stated the truth. Cardinal Noe, he was for years in the Vatican. He was a former papal MC, involved with the liturgy in the Vatican, by no means a traditionalist. But he has stated that he himself knows what that much argued about statement by Pope Paul VI, made in the 1970s about the smoke of Satan entering the sanctuary of the church, actually meant. Cardinal Noe has said that he knows what that statement means. And many of you have read it in book after book after book. Pope Paul VI has been quoted many times. Pope Paul VI said publicly, "The smoke of Satan has entered the sanctuary of the church." And these preachers would get up and preach about that smoke of Satan and so on and so forth. But when they'd comment on it, they could only give their best guess about what it meant, because they didn't know. Cardinal Noe says he knows. And you can read this yourself. Website, Petrus website, and it's also on the What Does the Prayer Really Say website. Go and look it up yourself. Interview with Cardinal Noe, quote, this is what it says. He was the MC at the Vatican. Pope Paul VI's denunciation of the presence of the smoke of Satan in the church is unforgettable. Still today, that discourse seems to be incredibly relevant. That's the interviewer given the question, and this is what the Cardinal said. "You from Petrus have gotten a real scoop here, because I'm in a position to reveal for the first time what Paul VI desired to denounce with that statement. Smoke of Satan had entered the church. Here it is. Pope Montini. For Satan meant to include all those priests or bishops and cardinals who didn't render worship to the Lord by celebrating badly Holy Mass, because of a wrong interpretation of the implementation of the Second Vatican Council. He spoke of the smoke of Satan because he maintained that those priests who turned Holy Mass into dry straw in the name of creativity in reality were possessed of the vainglory and pride of the evil one. So the smoke of Satan was nothing other than the mentality which wanted to distort the traditional and liturgical canons of the Eucharistic ceremony." And he concluded the interview with this, because he was not a traditionalist at the time, but he's getting old now, and he concluded it this way. "Now it is necessary to recover, and in a hurry, the sense of the sacred before the smoke of Satan completely pervades the whole church." He gave this interview last year. Thanks be to God, we have Pope Benedict XVI. His Mass and his liturgical style are an example of correctness and dignity. Close quote. He gave that last year. And that quote from Smoke of Satan goes back 30 years. So why are people like Cardinal Noe finally telling us the truth? Because Pope Benedict has finally cleared the way, thanks be to God. But none of this is new, not one bit of it that he's doing. None of it is new. Anybody that was at seminary and that read Cardinal Ratzinger's work knew he was talking about this 15 years ago. Not anything new. He made it perfectly clear in his books over and over again that as a young priest, he, Cardinal Ratzinger, was dismayed by the so-called liturgical renewal. He was upfront about it. He told everybody that wanted to hear. He wrote book after book. But before he retired, he decided to write his memoirs, his autobiography called Milestones. Ignatius Press puts it out. I recommend it. And it is available to everyone from Ignatius Press. And much of it's on the net. There's people that get right off the book and put it on the net. But listen to this, and remember, when he wrote this, his memoirs, he thought he was just going to quit being a cardinal and go into retirement. That's what he thought he was going to. But he became Pope. And he didn't know he was going to be Pope when he wrote this. So this is what he wrote. You can go get the book Milestones and read it yourself. I'll only give the key quotes. This is from his autobiography before he became Pope and didn't know he was going to be Pope. Quote, "The second great event at the beginning of my years in Regensburg was the publication of the Missal of Pope Paul VI. That's the new Mass, which was accompanied by the almost total prohibition of using the Missal we had until then. But I was dismayed by the prohibition of the old missal, since nothing of the sort had ever happened in the entire history of the liturgy. He's publicly writing these things. Quote, the prohibition of the missal that was now decreed, a missal that had known continuous growth over the centuries, starting with the sacramentaries of the ancient church, that introduced a breach into the history of the liturgy whose consequences could only be tragic. It was reasonable and right of the council to order a revision of the missal, such as often take place, something small. But more than this now happened. The old building was demolished, and another was built, to be sure, largely using materials from the previous one, and even the old floor plans, setting it as a new construction over against what had grown historically, forbidding the results of that historical growth. This has caused enormous harm. For then the impression had to emerge that the liturgy is something we can make, to be made, not something given in advance by God, but something lying within our own power of decision. And this is how he ended that particular part. You ought to read the whole part. I am convinced that the crisis in the church that we are experiencing today is to a large extent due to the disintegration of the liturgy. Let's repeat that. I am convinced that the crisis in the church that we are experiencing today is to a large extent due to the disintegration of the liturgy. Close quote. So even as a young priest, the Pope says he was dismayed. He's been public about it all along. And he publicly said so. But if you were a priest or a seminarian at the time when he wrote this, may the Lord help you.